Three.
Welcome to the Critical Christian Podcast. We're your hosts, Dan
and Justin, where we ask difficult questions about the Bible
and provide questionable answers. Is that good?
Yeah, this week we're going to be in chapter 9, reviewing Noah and his sons and the post-flood events. Given that we're only going to be reading through one chapter this week, we're going to read most of the chapter along with our questions, especially because there's some nuance that is provided within each verse. And there's not a lot of fluff in the chapter either that needs to be cut out.
No fluff.
All right, without further ado, Dan, should we do 9:1?
Yeah, 9:1.
Actually, we can do 9:1 and 2, correct?
9:1 and 2.
Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and on all the birds of the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands." Now, Dan, we touched on this briefly last week.
We did, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we don't want to cover it in depth, but we do want to just kind of make a note, maybe a summary of what we thought on this verse.
That's a good idea.
What are your thoughts?
Well, here are my thoughts. And the thoughts are that...
Articulate as always.
Okay, so I guess we're talking about the fear and dread of you will fall on all beasts. So I assume the assumption is that before this happened, animals did not fear men.
Right.
Of course, I guess animals would have had no reason to fear men if in the next, verse, like we hadn't been eating them until now.
Right. I think so.
Yeah, I wouldn't be afraid of somebody if they're not going to eat me, right?
Right. I think there's a general consensus that this matches the common belief that, within the garden at the early period, the animals and the beasts and the humans were essentially coexisting in harmony. I think we'd have to assume that the lions or carnivorous animals were not a threat to mankind.
Right.
Until. Well, something interesting, though, is, and you noticed in verse 3, it says, "Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you, just as I give you the green plants, now I give you everything." Now, right. There's an allowance for eating meat, but along with this allowance is kind of a weird pronouncement.
It's like, now you can eat meat, but these animals might kill you. As well.
Right. Yeah, these animals are now going to be afraid of you.
Yeah.
As though it presumes that the animals know they're going to be hunted. Is that right. What?
Yeah.
Is that the connection here? Is that?
Yeah, I think so.
How cruel would it be if God said, "Now you can eat all the animals, but they will not be afraid of you"? Can you imagine just walking up to an animal, not knowing that you could kill them and just capping them?
Yeah, I'm sure they wouldn't like that.
No, I feel like at least for the sake of sport, this command from God seems to be necessary.
And hunting is definitely a sport.
Especially in the industrialized world. Hunting is really more of a leisurely
I mean, sport. Fish don't even count as meat, according to the Pope, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. On verse 3, about the plants was once food for you, and of course now all the living animals are food now. I wrote a note in here just as a reminder that was interesting, and initially the animals were created as companions for Adam.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And Eve was only created because it seemed like the animals were not a suitable companion. They didn't rise to the level of, living maybe a monogamous, long-term relationship with.
Yeah.
That being said, it seems like they were not just taken down a notch, but maybe 100 notches from these are your very close companions to you're going to now eat the animals. It just seems like such a drastic move, right? But it does, of course, provide a lot of explanatory power. Like if you lived in ancient times, you want to know why there's animosity between animals and humans, and you can't just all live in harmony and peace, right?
I mean, I never thought of it because they're just food.
Sure.
But I guess some people might have thought, wow, how come they're so mean to us?
Right. Or say if you're a child asks really good questions. If God's all powerful and he created everything, well, why did he create animals to eat each other?
Right. I get that. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of perceived evil in nature, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Nature's pretty dark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess it wasn't always like that because they just ate plants.
Sure. And so this does at least explain the current state of affairs. But there is a very large looming prohibition against what you can't do. Dan, let's jump into that next.
Sure. Let's see. We're looking at verse 4. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it.
Yeah.
Which to me meant you can't eat meat if you don't cook it first.
Sure.
That's
maybe.
I mean, I'm sure that's wrong, but that's what I took from it.
It does bring up a good question, and we'll get into maybe why this prohibition exists here in a minute. But on the idea of having to cook it first, it seems to me that the process of cooking, I don't know to what effect it removes the blood from the meat itself.
I mean, it's healthier, obviously. They won't get sick, right?
Right.
So it's very possible that's the only way God could think to get them to actually do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So is it possible to cook the meat and the blood still be retained within it?
Probably not, unless you don't cook it very much, like rare.
Right. Well, I mean, when you think of what is in blood, right? What is blood comprised of?
Hemoglobin.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that flows through the veins, all kinds of stuff. And then, a certain portion of it is like in liquid form, so water-based. So when you cook the meat, theoretically, based on my assumptions here, theoretically the water evaporates.
Yeah.
Or, it is converted into steam, and then it sort of dissipates from the meat through natural processes. But what's left behind would be any of the solids that are in the blood, right? So, I mean, just if we're going to be nitpicky about it, right?
Yeah.
Cooking the meat, we would know would necessarily get rid of some of the liquid, but not all of the solid parts that are floating within the bloodstream. So you would still be consuming the blood if you cooked it. But I would have to assume that in ancient times, none of this is known. And that,
especially if they're just now starting to eat them, right?
Right. Yeah. My assumption is that you're correct, that this prohibition partly could have been put into effect to kind of say maybe you should cook the meat. But also, there's more to it than that, because there was a process in ritual sacrifice for draining the blood.
Was that before or after?
Yeah, there was a process for draining the blood, and then even uses for the blood once it was drained.
Well, were there sacrifices before this verse?
Yeah, there were some sacrifices, but
animal sacrifices, or
yeah,
because I know Cain and Able, they did fruits and vegetables, right?
Well, one of them sacrificed livestock, and one of them provided an offering of fruit and vegetables.
Okay.
So
I don't remember which was which.
Yeah, so Cain's offering was not accepted, which was an offering of the produce, whereas Abel's offering of the first of the flock was accepted. So there was an early sacrifice, plus there was a sacrifice right after Noah got off the boat.
Okay, and wait a minute. Right after he got off the boat, they talked about, didn't they talk about eating that?
It
that
was
sacrifice?
a pleasing aroma to the Lord.
Yeah, but I thought it mentioned that everybody was supposed to eat it.
I don't believe so, but just one chapter back, we can revisit that real quick, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, after looking at it, I was wrong. All right.
Oh, so we're not going to reread it. Okay. All right. So then, I mean, yeah, we have at least two instances so far of sacrifice. And then another instance of God killing an animal, to provide clothing. But in none of those instances is there a description of blood being drained. But at least one of those does include cooking the. I assume cooking the.
Wow. So at that point, those animals would have been like, "Hey, buddy, what's going on?" You know?
Yeah.
Wait,
how confusing is that?
Why am I being burnt alive? I thought we were friends.
Right. So, well, I mean, they didn't burn it while it was alive. They slit the throat, drained the blood.
All right, fine. A little better.
A
little better.
Yeah. So it's not like a lobster in a boiling pot of water or anything like that.
Right.
As to the provision to not consume the lifeblood, why is that important? And I think we touched on this previously. The lifeblood was sacred and it belonged to God as the giver and the keeper of all things that are living.
Okay.
So the lifeblood belonged to the Lord. And that's why Abel's blood cried out from the ground, to God, especially the innocent bloodshed. We talked about how the bloodshed of the innocent defiles the land. But there's a really interesting provision for the Gentiles that were converting to Christianity that we read about in Acts 15. One of the early problems in the Christian church was, what do we do with the Gentiles because they don't follow the Jewish laws? But they have to interact with us. So how do we coexist with the Gentiles without defiling our own people? And they came up with a short list of, we'll say, the bare minimum standards that the Gentiles need to adhere to in order to have non-defiling relations with the Jewish church at that time. So they wrote to them and said to tell them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from meat of strangled animals, and from the blood, coming from said animal.
Strangling animals?
Yeah.
I hope that means something different than what I think it means.
It was a method of killing the animal. So in Jewish life, when you killed the animal, especially because you didn't typically kill an animal just to eat it. You usually killed it for the sacrifice, and then you participated in eating the animal.
Okay.
It almost always consisted of slitting it and letting the blood out first. Whereas if you strangle the animal, the blood is retained within the animal as it dies. And then if you cook it in that manner, imagine, because they're not modern century butchers, they're not butchering it up all the time and then picking the method in which they dissected it before cooking it was much more primitive. So by not strangling it, by actually letting the blood out first, you ensured that the blood was gone.
So is that just symbolic then?
Well, I don't think it's symbolic. It's just really interesting that this is such an important factor that the only 4 prohibitions that exist for the Gentiles entering the church happens to be this one that we see given to Noah. They're really interesting. It's also funny that, the concern was that, they don't have the law given to them. So how can we interact without being defiled by them?
Right.
And this particular provision was before the law was handed down, which is really kind of an interesting...
Oh, yeah, I get you.
Right?
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the problem with the blood, though, right?
Yeah.
So the blood was defiling, and we talked about that previously. Let's briefly, though, read shortly from Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12. All right, in Leviticus 17, 10 through 14, And also in Deuteronomy 12:23 through 24, we have some rationale behind the prohibition against consuming the blood. So this is the Lord talking to the Israelites. I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who eats the blood, and I will cut them off from the people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may any foreigner residing among you eat the blood. Any Israelite or foreigner residing among you who hunts any animal or bird that may be eaten must drain the blood out and cover it with earth, because the life of every creature is in its blood. That is why I have said to the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is in its blood. Anyone who eats it must be cut off. And then Deuteronomy, but be sure you do not eat the blood, because the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. You must not eat the blood, pour it out on the ground like water.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
it seems clear here that,
Mm-hmm.
You're eating something that is of sacred or divine status.
I mean, this is all symbolic anyhow, though, right?
I think we would say it's symbolic. I don't think the early audience.
Would God say it's symbolic?
I think these verses should be taken at face value.
Okay.
Meaning when God says this, the blood is the life and it is for making atonement, I think that's a literal statement. I don't think this is a metaphor here. And it would almost have to be a literal statement if we read further in the laws and we see that they're now using that blood to make atonement for their sins, which is, takes up the bulk of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy.
I mean, but it's still all just symbolic,
I don't think it was.
Because you can't really atone for sins by using blood, right?
Well, God said you could.
Well, and I guess you're allowed to, but you know what I mean, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's like when you get baptized. I mean, you don't have to get baptized with water.
Sure.
Or do you?
Well,
you see,
that is a great question for another day.
Yeah, I
because
know. I'm just saying, you're saying that one is symbolic and one isn't.
No. There's a very good case to argue that the baptism actually is for the remission of sins, as the Bible says, not symbolic.
Okay.
That it's a sacred rite,
and it has to be water,
that literally will wash away your sins, not figuratively.
Okay.
And I don't want to waste an episode on that, because that's a big topic.
I bet it is.
The Catholics are not the only ones that believe that.
Well, we'll get to that in the New Testament, right? I think that's 10 years.
Yeah, we'll get there sometime in 2026, maybe.
Okay.
Let's get through Genesis, and then we'll
all right.
worry about that too much. But to be sure, my view here, and I'm willing to be wrong, but I think this is made to be taken literally. I don't believe that this was a figurative viewpoint. So, again, I could be wrong. Maybe we should move on to verse 5. Dan, can you read that?
Sure. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being.
Right. And you had a question on this.
I did.
What was your question?
So, can you scroll back up, please? So initially, I thought it was, I will demand an accounting for every animal. So, I mean, that's kind of nice. Like when
Like an enumeration?
I'll have to look that word up. But, it's basically like, don't kill things for no reason. You know what I mean? But now I see that it says, I will demand an accounting from every animal. And I don't think animals can really account for anything, right? So am I just misreading it?
Yeah, I don't think that the animals are doing any accounting.
Right.
Like, I don't think they have the ability to do math yet.
I don't think so. Not yet.
Right.
So why does it bother mentioning the animals?
I think he's saying here that God necessarily would be keeping an account of the lifeblood that is spilt
Mm-hmm.
from the animals and humans. Not that the animals are doing the accounting. No, surely here it says, "I will demand an accounting
Mm-hmm.
of the blood that is spilt, from the animals and
Well,
from
so
human
I mean,
beings."
so it is like,
Like a reckoning.
so is it about killing animals and not eating them then, or wasting them? You know what I mean? Is that what we're talking about here, or is that totally off?
That's a good question.
You know?
So, yeah, is part of this that God is demanding that the animals be killed responsibly,
Right. That's what I'm saying.
have the blood drained and then consumed responsibly,
Right.
and then not killed for sport.
For sport. Right.
Yeah, and interesting. You remember, the passage about Nimrod when he's introduced at the beginning of the Tower of Babel story.
Sure do. But why don't you tell
What said of
everybody
Nimrod?
else? What?
It said of Nimrod, kind of a negative statement. It's
He was
assumed.
he was a hunter.
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of assumed that that's a negative stereotype.
Oh,
And remember
interesting.
Jacob and Esau?
Sure do.
Which one of those was favored? Which one of those brothers?
Pretty sure it was Jacob.
Yeah. Which one of those was a hunter?
I'm going to say Esau.
You got it.
Pretty good at this.
Yeah, there seems to be a negative stereotype
That's interesting.
around hunting animals for sport.
I wonder what Christians who do hunt for sport would say about this.
I would say most of them have never read the Old Testament with any type of intentionality.
Or the New Testament.
I mean, we don't know that. I mean,
know.
there's a lot of Christians out there that hunt.
I'll make the broad generalizations. You're fine. All
That's right. Okay. You're only offending half of our viewing audience.
Yeah, but the other half loves us. All right.
All 10 of them?
I don't think we have that many.
No, we're definitely closer to 5. All right. So, and 2 of those are our mothers. All right. So, the account. Well, first of all, on your point,
Yeah.
that perhaps there is a call of accountability on consuming animals responsibly. I think that's true, and I think that's reflected here in this passage. Yeah, but also I think that part of this is just saying that any misuse of the lifeblood will be accounted for. So God is not going to just let it slide. Yeah, and then it even goes on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the lifeblood. Dan, can you read verse 6 for us?
Sure. Whoever sheds human blood, by human shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind.
Yeah. That is a really, really interesting command.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a question, actually multiples, listed on this particular verse. Can you...
Yeah, so is this the origination of an eye for an eye? You know?
Mm-hmm. It certainly would seem that way.
And is that really a Christian, isn't that what Christians should believe? I know Christians didn't exist back then, but,
And one of the really interesting things, too, about the eye for an eye, right, in relation to Christianity is, remember, Jesus said, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say to you." So Jesus was delivering a higher law. But in this passage here, this is before the law was given. This is just a universal command for all mankind. So it would seem that Jesus
refuting it.
Yeah, necessarily refuting it, because this seems to be an eternal command.
Which is weird, because I thought Jesus came to fulfill the law, right?
Right, that's what they say.
So I don't get that.
But this is outside the law.
Well, I mean, it's a universal, so it's beyond the law, right? It's higher,
right?
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So
anyways,
here's my question then.
Yes.
And this is stupid, but was forgiveness not a thing? Before Jesus?
Right. I'm going to say that forgiveness was a thing before Jesus. There are multiple times in the Old Testament where God is angry. Say, we see that a lot with the Israelites in the desert, where God is angry,
Right.
and Moses, quote unquote, talks him off of the ledge.
Right.
I think the most famous is probably what in Exodus 34, where God is ready to smite all the Israelites at once, and Moses has to convince them not to.
Yeah.
And there's a number of times where we see that in the Old Testament where God is, we'll say, persuaded or he's moved. So, and there's a number of occasions too where we would say forgiveness is granted to the Israelites by God. We read that in the prophets quite a bit, where God punishes the Israelites, but then there is a pronouncement that after the punishment, he is going to forgive and rebuild and preserve the Israelites.
Or just grant mercy. Is there a difference between mercy and forgiveness?
It's a good question. Is there a difference between mercy and forgiveness? Give me half a second to think on that one.
All right.
Well, I think mercy and forgiveness are related, but if you have mercy, you can have mercy without forgiving somebody. I think having mercy is just not giving somebody what is due to them.
Well, that's
because of their sin.
What God was doing, right? He was being merciful and saying, okay, I won't kill you, even though you definitely deserve it, you know?
Sure, but I don't know if forgiveness is the same thing. So forgiveness necessitates an erasing of the sin or the debt, whereas mercy doesn't erase the sin or the debt, it just eliminates the punishment for that sin or debt.
Well, are you saying that God actually forgave all these things? Because it seems like they were just accumulating, you know what I mean? And so if they're accumulating, then they're building on each other, and he didn't really forgive them.
Yeah, if they're accumulating, but there's no retribution delivered for them, then I would imagine that's called mercy. Whereas, the act of forgiveness is eliminating.
Right.
Which is, so I guess, like I said, they're related, but they're a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dan, just a couple passages I want to briefly go over some instances of forgiveness in the Old Testament.
Okay.
I think it'll become more clear here. So this is Leviticus 16:30. On this day, atonement will be made for you to cleanse you. Then before the Lord, you will be clean from your sins. Of course, this is following sacrifice and the atonement ritual. Here's another one from Numbers. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sins of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the earth. And then one from the Psalms. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and whose spirit is no deceit. Here's one from Isaiah 43. Even I, am he who blots out your transgressions for my own sake and remembers your sins no more. I mean, so there's a lot of passages about forgiveness in the Old Testament, but I think the key difference is that the forgiveness that we see in the Old Testament is kind of part of the sacrificial system for the most part. It seems to be that the forgiveness is part of the atonement ritual, or the other offerings that are required.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Can we go back to the blood for a second?
I think we should. Yeah. Let's talk about the blood.
I got two questions.
Sure.
And they're both stupid.
I'm sure they'd be great.
You ever heard of blood pudding?
I have.
Now it's made with actual blood, as it turns out.
Right.
Is it a sin to eat that? Because blood is for God, right? you're not supposed to eat blood, right?
Yeah, I mean, based on the plain text of the Old Testament, I would say the answer to that is yes.
Now, here's another follow-up for that. Do you think that's the reason vampires suck blood? Is because vampires are, in lore, they're demons, right? And
Well,
so,
I mean, vampires don't really exist
Yeah,
according
yeah.
to the biblical text.
Yeah, great. But as far as, when they were created for, fiction, they figured, okay, what is the biggest affront to God?
Hmm.
Is having this creature suck the blood out of somebody.
Yeah, you mean the imagery that we see with vampires
Mm.
was part of that imagery based upon the idea that it's incredibly offensive to the biblical image.
Mm. I was just thinking about that. No, the blood pudding, that's a sin.
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Right?
for sure. Although I don't think the ancient Hebrews were having blood pudding.
No.
On the passage in verse 6, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for the image of God has God made. Oh, I'm sorry, for in the image of God has God made mankind. So there's a really interesting passage that talks about what's happening here in Numbers 35, because God here is basically okaying this idea that if someone sheds blood, somebody must avenge that blood.
Mm-hmm.
And there's enough text in the Old Testament laws that speak to this that we should definitely pull out at least one of them. So here's Numbers 35, 16 through 19. If anyone strikes somebody a fatal blow with an iron object, that person is a murderer. The murderer is to be put to death. Or if anyone is holding a stone and strikes somebody a fatal blow with it, that person is a murderer. The murderer is to be put to death. Or if anyone is holding a wooden object and strikes someone with a fatal blow, that person is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. I think you see a pattern here so far. Well, here's the interesting part in 19. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death. When the avenger comes upon the murderer, the avenger shall put the murderer to death. So, who is the avenger?
I'm going to presume it's God, right?
I wish it was that easy.
Okay.
So, the avenger is a person.
Okay. So maybe their family?
Yeah, quite.
Okay.
Well, not the family of the person that committed the offense.
No, the other family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be the family of the person who was killed. There's another prohibition that we see at the end of Numbers 35. It says, do not pollute the land where you are. Bloodshed pollutes the land, and atonement cannot be made for the land on which the blood has been shed, except by the blood of the one who shed it. Do not defile the land where you live, where I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell among the Israelites.
Okay.
So it's interesting here that the shedding the innocent blood is a crime that defiles the land, but by shedding the blood of the guilty party, it offsets the blood of the innocent. Isn't that intriguing?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it seemed that it would be incentivizing you to make sure that the offender is put to death. Because if not, the land in which God dwells becomes polluted.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't have that. That's why the Canaanites are getting removed from the land.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that and, what we're about to talk about, Noah's sons. Maybe we should go there right now.
Okay.
And move into the next part of chapter 9.
Okay.
As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. We've heard this before.
Yes, we have.
Yeah, so this is essentially attempt number 2.
Yeah.
Right? God's gonna try this all over again and see what happens.
Or number 3, because he tried the dinosaurs and those failed.
Yeah. I think we're going to count the dinosaurs as attempt number 1, Adam and Eve attempt number 2, Noah and his family attempt number 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that works. And can you read 8 through 11 for us, Dan?
Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of the flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth.
Very good. So I think you probably have some comments on this. I wrote a couple notes myself.
I think I do.
So, part of me feels like the promise to never flood the earth again might have the ability to explain why the flood was a one-time thing.
Yeah.
So if you're a person who has heard about this flood a long time ago and you're wondering, well, how come there's never been? It seems like such an implausible story. How come we've never seen something of this nature? Well, the reason is because, God promised that he would never do it again. And so that's why, while it seems improbable that it happened a long time ago because it's not happening today, this is why. So it solves that kind of dilemma.
Inconsistency, right?
Yeah, it what's the word I'm looking for? It takes care of the dissonance.
I think a lot of these, chapters were written, a long time after everything happened, but they were doing it just so that they could fix all the inconsistencies with the Bible,
Well, some of that definitely happened, and when we start talking about Noah's sons, we are definitely going to see that.
Right.
On a similar note, and here's a question, Dan. Let me see what you think about this. Why did God need to make a covenant with Noah to not flood the earth? Because could he have just never done it again and never told anyone?
Yeah. I mean, there are so many other ways you can kill people. So it's not like, oh, wow, that's so generous of you. Never going to kill us with a flood,
Yeah.
I mean,
sure.
Volcano, sure.
Sure.
Not a flood, though,
But is it necessary to make an agreement or a covenant with Noah on this point rather than just say, I'm just not going to do it?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really add anything, does it?
The only thing I could figure that it adds is that maybe it's necessary to move into explaining rainbows.
Okay.
Because the very next thing is the sign, the sign in the sky.
And people were just baffled by rainbows back in the day?
Right. And so I said, well, especially because remember God dwelt in the skies, in the heavens, and the rainbows are in the heavens as well. And so the rainbows could very well be a heavenly manifestation after the rain. And well, what purpose would it serve? Well, it was God's promise that he would never do this again.
Right.
And we see that in verses 12 through 16. We won't read it because everyone's really familiar with this passage.
They're just trying to figure out explanations for the unexplainable.
Right.
Except now we have the explanations.
Right. And that's true. Yeah. So you had a really good question I wanted to pick up on in the conversation between God and Noah in terms of making the covenant and the sign of the covenant. And that is, here it says, God is talking about himself in third person. It says, whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures. That's like saying, when I see you, Dan, I'll remember the covenant between you and Justin. Like, wait, what? I'm Justin. It's such an odd phrasing, right?
Yeah.
It almost seems to me like it was a story that was written down probably originally in third person and combined or added to a speech, and then that speech no one cared to fix the personage when they went between first and third. Just another reason why so many people believe that the Noah and a lot of other Genesis stories were composites of multiple editions.
Okay, so the way you're talking about it makes me think that maybe you're proving that the Bible is, say, not inerrant, because that's clearly just a
A composite of
No, it's wrong. You wouldn't use.
well, God can talk about himself in first
Sure,
or third person or whatever he wants,
whatever
right?
he wants, but I think we can agree that's not the correct way to form the sentence, right?
Well, first of all, I think you know my position on biblical inerrancy is that I'm not an inerrantist.
Right, I get that.
So
A lot of people are, though.
a lot of people are right off the gate, and we can dedicate a whole episode to that. So I don't want to get too much into it.
Right.
All that to say is I don't think this is a reason to throw inerrancy out the window. I think this is more of a grammatical artifact, and I wouldn't count this as
so
an
it's
error.
just being translated wrong, maybe?
Well, that's another point. It could, if you're a believer in the documentary hypothesis and multiple authors and editors, then you would say this is just an artifact of combining multiple stories. But if you believe that the originals were perfect and that they were corrupted over many generations, then this could be an artifact of corruption, not from stitching. So it kind of depends on which one you go with. But
either way, it doesn't feel like that it's inerrant. But anyhow,
it does give you a feeling of uneasiness because, especially in American modern Christianity, we are taught that every single word of the scripture is perfect and God breathed.
Right.
So then surely God speaking about himself in third person is either an editing error of some nature, which why would it be there if it was God breathed? Or perhaps there's a greater purpose for it being this way and we're just unaware of what that purpose is.
Yeah. That's probably what they'd say.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, we're just, we've lost the meaning to time.
Yeah.
Or it's lost in translation, as they say. At the second part of this, which ties in with the rainbow, is whether or not rainbows had existed before this time. And so my thought was, if we assume that rainbows had yet to exist until the time of Noah, then we would have to also assume that the mechanism that creates rainbows also did not exist. Does that mean that clouds and rain had not yet existed? If so, what was preventing the water from evaporating and becoming clouds? If there were clouds before Noah but no rain, what was the physics that allowed the clouds to hold all the moisture but never release it? Surely the clouds would reach a saturation point and have to release the water in the form of rain. So the physics of how our atmosphere works would have had to been drastically different to not have rain or rainbows. But surely the rain and the rainbow are tied together. And then I think that's also part of the symbology there too, is that the rainbow comes after the rain.
Yeah.
Which makes it a perfect reminder that God once flooded the earth, but he'll never do it again. Because you're so overjoyed when the rain finally stops that it's not a flood, right?
Right.
Any other thoughts on that, Dan?
Actually, yeah. I know we were talking about the flood and we were trying to decide whether it was worldwide or localized. But I feel like, if you believe every part of the Bible, this kind of makes it so it had to have been worldwide, right?
Yeah, certainly the...
Otherwise, a tsunami would count as breaking the covenant, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the covenant with Noah definitely suggests that the biblical story is pertaining to a global flood, not a localized flood. And it's really interesting, too. And there's no way to prove this, but it almost seems like the rainbow is a sign that is expected to be able to be seen from many locations, like a symbol to mankind. But of course, we know in modern day that rainbows are really localized symbols.
Right.
You would see it in Cleveland, but not from the same rainbow from Akron.
So back then, when they wrote this, they thought this was proving that it was worldwide. But what they actually did was prove that it was localized.
Well, perhaps. I don't know if they proved anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, let's move on
Yeah.
to the sons of Noah, because this is about to get really heated.
Okay.
Dan, can you read 18 through 20?
Sure. The sons of Noah came out of the ark. Who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. Wink. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent.
Yep. Narrator kind of assumes that we know something's about to happen.
Yeah.
This is a pretty drastic turn of events here, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had some questions on this, Dan. Can you kind of go over some of your thoughts
Sure.
and questions?
So, is lying naked a sin? I mean, you got to cover up that modesty, right?
Right. Yeah. So I had a similar question. How much responsibility for what's about to happen lie on Noah's shoulders, and how much?
Right. A lot.
Not so much. But is lying naked a sin?
Right.
And I think the clear answer from the passage which we're about to get to is no. I don't believe it is.
Which is kind of weird.
Especially because I don't believe, in the scripture at least,
Mm-hmm.
We get the impression that there is almost, not entirely, there's almost a culpability, or there is a lack of culpability of things done while drunk. Very few times do we see anybody being punished for something that they did while they were drunk, even though in the biblical story there is a negative connotation tied to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when Lot accidentally sleeps with his daughters, right?
That's we'll get to that.
Right. Was he punished for that? No, he wasn't.
Oh boy.
But it was tied. The story makes it appear, though, that his drunkenness was a very negative outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. And the only other time I could think of that somebody was quote unquote punished for being drunk were the two sons, I believe the sons of Eli, who was it the sons of Eli? No, they were scoundrels as well. Sorry, these were the sons of Moses' brother, who went into the Holy of Holies drunk, and offered incense, unholy incense.
And then they were struck down, right?
They were consumed by fire.
Yeah, I was right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that seems like being drunk is bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that time they were.
But of course, I bet it wasn't even about being drunk. I bet it was about going into the Holy of Holies, right?
That was the thing. They went in and they offered an unauthorized, burning of incense, and then they were consumed by God, presumably because they were doing something they shouldn't have been doing inside of the tabernacle. And then, of course, right after that, there was a command not to consume alcohol, or the same, not to consume alcohol in the presence of the Lord, or the same could happen to you. There's one other note on drinking alcohol that might be interesting, in that the people who take the Nazirite vow, like Samson, were prohibited from drinking alcohol. So it would seem that there's a view of alcohol that if you want to reach the most pure and holy level, that consuming alcohol would be a no-go. But there is not a prohibition against drinking alcohol, or really even getting drunk, even though there are plenty of passages that speak of the negative impacts of being drunk.
So it seems like those two gentlemen that were consumed by fire should have probably gotten a pass since they were just drunk, you know?
But they were drunk in the Lord's holy
Yeah, but
place.
Sure, but they were probably drunk outside of it and then wandered inside, right? You know what I mean?
Oh, you mean should they have been given a pass because they didn't do it knowingly?
Right.
They did it while they were drunk.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't think God would make a distinction because even remember touching the ark could result in you getting smitten. So one time when the ark was being transported, somebody lost a step, reached out and touched the ark for balance, and boom, he was smitten.
Yeah, and that's terrible.
It wasn't because he sinned.
Right.
It was because he just did something that was unauthorized.
Yeah.
Because of the holy and all-consuming nature of God.
Yeah, I get that.
Right.
So it's just one of those things that happens. Nobody's at fault.
Right.
It's just one of those things.
Yeah.
Is that basically how this works?
I think it is.
All right.
Yeah. Anyways, was lying naked a sin? I don't think it was a sin, but it certainly seems here that the biblical writer is setting us up to say that Noah did something he shouldn't have done, and then it resulted in somebody else committing a sin, which we're definitely going to get to. You had noted here, and we're going to get to it as well, it seems to be explaining why some of the descendants of Noah were mistreated by the Israelites, and that's 100% true. Before we move on to that, we're going to talk all about the nations that come from Noah, but I wrote here that it's interesting that Noah and his family were specifically saved out of all of humanity. But the very first thing that happens after the flood is that he plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and then lays around naked. Then his son seemingly views him naked with some kind of sinful intent. So 2 of the 8 people that were saved because they were righteous from among all the people of the world pretty much immediately start to be implicated in sinful behavior, which it just kind of calls into question the whole idea of, well, we have to wipe out all of mankind and save only these 8 righteous people, but then immediately a significant portion of the 8 righteous people they're acting unrighteously, right?
Yeah.
So with that, let's move on to 22, because we're going to get really interesting here. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked, and he told his brothers outside. Now that seems to be rather innocent.
Yeah, he's just saying, hey guys, we should probably do something about this.
Right.
You know?
Right. Now,
I mean, he didn't get like a camera and post it on Instagram or anything, you know?
Right. I mean, he did. I mean, the ancient version of posting something on Instagram, I guess, is the same as what he had there, which is telling somebody outside of people that were present.
I mean, his family, though.
Right.
You know?
Well, who else was there to tell? Relatively speaking, that's all you had, right?
Yeah.
So you could say he announced it to the world.
You could.
Anyways, Klaus Westermann, we've talked about Westermann quite a bit, and we'll continue to talk about him because he comes up a lot in the Old Testament commentary, especially in the book of Genesis. That's kind of his area of specialty. There we go. Westermann suggests that it's because drunkenness was not a sin in antiquity, and that it was the duty of a good son to protect his father in times of drunkenness, that Ham was punished.
Okay.
And the example that he gives is from the Canaanite tale of Akkad. And this is a really interesting tale about a guy named Daniel, or Daniel, depending on how you want to pronounce it, who is sonless.
Okay.
And he prays to Baal and to El to provide him a son. And eventually, Baal persuades El to grant his petition. Now, in that persuasion given to El, there's kind of a justification for, why he deserves a son or why he needs a son. And part of that justification kind of includes some of the common expectations for a son, like what you would expect your son to do for you,
Yeah.
or what are the benefits for having a good son, right? And so here it said to El, surely there is a son for him like his brothers, a scion to act unto his kindreds, and give oblation to the gods to eat, an offering. I apologize, the wording on this translation is going to be very King James like. Oblation to drink to the holy ones. Wilt thou not bless him, O Bol El, my father? So this is Baal talking to El. Beatify him, O creator of the creatures. So shall there be a son in his house, a scion in the midst of his palace, who sets up the stele of his ancestral spirits. In the holy place, the protectors of his clan, who frees his spirit from the earth. From the dust guards his footsteps, who smothers the life force of his detractor, drives off who attacks his abode. And then he ends here, who takes him by the hand when he's drunk and carries him when he is sated with wine. But it seems here, in the ancient Near East, there's rather kind of an expectation that wine will be enjoyed. And, the effect of it being enjoyed thoroughly would be that you would become intoxicated and maybe lose some of your senses. But if you have a good son, your son is there to protect you in those times and to take care of you. So we see here with Noah, though, his son Ham rather than the opposite. He not only viewed his father while he was drunk, but then told his brothers about it. And by doing so, maybe sort of degraded Noah's integrity, perhaps. It created an offense for himself and for his father. If he had not told his brothers, would the outcome be the same?
You mean if he just took care of himself?
Yeah, if he noticed his father's nakedness and then covered it and left.
I mean, on one hand, yeah, probably. On the other hand, my guess is he was supposed to stay with him too, right? Make sure he doesn't do anything else stupid.
Right. Or is part of the sin the fact that he allowed his father to get that drunk without supervision?
I don't think so, because that would mean all three sons are in trouble, right?
Sure. So maybe.
And it seems like you're allowed to get drunk, so.
Yeah. So maybe all three sons could have possibly been implicated in this, since none of them took care of him in his drunken state, but only one of them viewed the nakedness, which seems to be the source of the sin.
I mean, it seems like the source of the sin is not the viewing of the nakedness, but the not doing anything about it.
Yeah, and so that brings up a really good question, because a lot of people have wondered, is this an idiom? Viewing his father naked, is this an idiom for something else? Kind of like a lot of people believe when Ruth uncovered Boaz's feet, that it's an idiom for something that might have been somewhat dirty, just like saying Adam knew Eve.
Okay.
It's a way of kind of saying something without saying the dirty parts out loud. So when Ham viewed Noah's nakedness, is this possibly an idiom referring to something dirtier than what we see at face value?
I don't know what it could mean.
Right, neither do I.
Okay, yeah. I think that's silly.
It has been suggested, though, because it would seem that such a large punishment, which
right,
the cursing of his entire lineage, which we're about to read, seems an awfully.
But it's been done before, or in the future it will be done. When Moses kicks that rock, and so he's not allowed to go into the promised land.
Yeah, you mean
so there are
punishments that don't fit the crime.
Right. Yeah. There seems to be a lot of that in the Bible.
There will be some of those that come up. But I think you're right. I don't think it's an idiom. I think it's actually just, you should take it at face value for what it is, that it was inherently sinful to view your father naked here, or possibly to view anybody naked.
No, I don't think that was the sin. I don't think
Oh.
viewing somebody naked is a sin.
Oh, sorry.
I think what was a sin was that he didn't immediately cover up his father.
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's hold on to that thought
All right.
and read the next couple of verses. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked backwards and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so they would not see their father naked. So,
Well, that's a good point. I'll give you that.
They did cover Noah, but they made it a point that they didn't look at the nakedness.
I get that. Of course, the only way they would have known he was naked is if Ham told them. Otherwise, they would have seen him naked anyhow, right? I mean, you don't make a habit of walking backwards just in case somebody's going to be naked, right?
Right, and that brings up a really interesting point, is that perhaps Ham telling his brothers was served as a warning so that they wouldn't walk in and see his nakedness. Although the passage doesn't seem to paint that picture. Although in modern times we would assume that's why he told his brothers.
I thought he was just telling him to say, "Hey, what should we do about this?" You know?
Right.
Which seems, I mean, maybe he was the youngest, you know? Maybe he just didn't know what to do.
Right.
I mean, he probably didn't have too many people to talk to.
Well, I would think he's only got 7 other people to talk to.
And he can't talk to Noah, so that's
Well, he's drunk, so 6.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not a lot of people, you know.
Who are you gonna tell?
Right.
There's only so many.
I mean, I think it's very possible he just didn't know what to do.
Right. I think you're right, and I think anyone reading this story would find his actions to be normal and reasonable and actually accidental.
Yeah.
Which is the accidental nature of viewing your father naked seems to me the largest reason why the punishment for the crime doesn't fit. Not just that he did something that I would say is not a big deal, but that it happened by accident. Right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about the punishment. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out that his youngest son, and this is the interesting part, found out what his youngest son had done to him, right? He said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." He also said, "Praise be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem." So the first thing here is that it says that his son did it to him, which is really interesting, and why some people believe there might be an idiom stored in here as to, well, maybe viewing his father's nakedness was more than just accidentally viewing it. But it would be really difficult to know what in the world it would be referring to if it was an idiom.
I mean, maybe it was just laughing at him or something.
Oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah, and maybe telling his brothers.
Yeah,
he did so in jest.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I could see that. Yeah. I had a really interesting question, and we both had questions about this passage. And the first one that popped out at me was, is the God of Shem not also the God of Ham and Japheth? Because it says here, and this gets into the reason why this seems to be a story that was either written or edited at a much later period. It says, "Praise be the Lord God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem." Certainly at this time period, though, all of Noah and his children and their wives would have been righteous followers and worshipers of Yahweh.
Yeah.
Or Elohim.
I mean, at the very least, he should mention
Japheth,
the other son. Japheth.
Yeah. Well, he does. He gets there in the verse, but it just was striking to me that the way the passage was written was assuming a much later date, because it mentions Canaan, first of all, by name. So it has to be referring to the descendants of Ham, but that it appears that they don't have the same God. In 27, it says, "May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." And so one of the interesting things here is, first of all, I think we've already covered, and I don't know if we want to beat the horse completely dead, that this punishment is a little bit ridiculous.
Right.
But it obviously this is a justification for the enslavement of the Canaanites
Right.
and the murder of the Canaanites. But what's interesting here is the descendants of Shem and the descendants of Japheth don't seem to both be Israelites. Shem is clearly the father of the Israelites, or the Shemites, or the Semites, as we say in modern English. Whereas Japheth seems to be the ancestral father of those surrounding the Mediterranean locations, and also perhaps of the sea peoples that we see later invading Canaan. And if we assume those two people groups match up with Shem and Japheth, it's interesting to me that it says, may Japheth or his descendants live in the tents of Shem or the Semites. So it seems here that whoever the descendants of Japheth were, they were living in the land given to Shem's descendants or the Israelites, which means it's either got to be the sea peoples or a people group often referred to as the Habiru. Are you familiar with the Habiru?
No.
Oh, really interesting people group that shows up a couple hundred years before the Exodus.
Okay.
So we read about them being in the land of Canaan and then really infiltrating the land of Canaan during the conquest narratives. And there's also possibly a connection between Japheth and the sea people, who we kind of affiliate often with the Philistines. But to be sure, the sea peoples invaded Canaan from all sides, from the top, from the north to the south, the whole coastal regions. But they're definitely most affiliated with the Philistine territories within, I would say, that within the biblical narratives. And the Egyptians speak of them being there as well.
So they're not good people, right?
They seem to, if they're part of the Philistines, they would be characterized as bad.
Right.
Because they fight with the Israelites a lot in the Old Testament.
But they're still not as bad as the descendants of Ham?
Exactly.
Okay.
But if they're bad, if we assume that the descendants of Japheth were resulting in the Philistine people, it's odd to me that God is saying extend Japheth's territory like it's a blessing.
Right. Yeah.
But then he's necessarily blessing a people group that were opposed to Israel, right?
I mean, they were trying to take over the Promised Land, right?
Right.
So
they failed, obviously.
Yeah.
Now, if we assume that we're talking about the Philistines versus Israelites here, and that the result is that the Philistines live within the tents of the Israelites, that means it has to have been that the Israelites prevailed over the Philistines. And that didn't really happen until close to the United Monarchy when King David was alive, which means this portion of the passage probably originates from David's time or Solomon's time or even later.
Yeah. That's how you can date this then, right?
There's internal evidence, as we would call it, for dating, So that was interesting to me. All right, Dan, can you carry us out and read 28 and 29?
Sure. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Noah lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. So I assume we take away the zeros, and that means he lived 35 years and lived a total of 95 years?
I mean, realistically, that's probably accurate.
Because we talked earlier about how...
Well, this is written in Hebrew, not ancient Sumerian.
All right. I give up.
I would suspect that the numbers here are interpreted as we see them today, 350 and 950. The reason why those numbers are so high, though, are probably rooted in the inability for the ancient Hebrew people and even the ancient Babylonian and Akkadian people to understand the very ancient Sumerian language. So, and once again, we've discussed this, so we're not gonna.
I'll have to rewatch the video.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you want more information on this particular topic, I would suggest YouTubing or Googling the Sumerian king list. There would be a wealth of information on this. And with that, I believe our time's definitely up.
Yep.
We've got a little bit over, so you have a little extra free of charge. If you have any questions, as always, please leave it in the comments. If there's something we missed, something we didn't consider, maybe some answers that were left on the table and undiscussed, please let us know. We're always looking for more information and for questions concerning the coming passages. You're welcome to throw them in the comments. Any question will be considered. And until we see you next time, like and subscribe.
And maybe when we hit 100 subscribers, we'll have like a special mailbag video where we answer your questions.
That's a great idea.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for viewing.
All right. Bye, guys.